What's up, family? Welcome back to the channel for another conversation. So glad to have you, or to be able to spend some time with you during this moment. I think this is going to be a pretty good conversation today, and so I'm excited about it. Actually, this was the one that I was going to have yesterday. I've had these notes for a while, but because of the way that work pivoted yesterday, it made more sense to do a shorter video. So today I'm going to be doing this video because I think this one will be a little lengthy. We'll see how it goes. Um, of course, before we do, make sure you subscribe to the video. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell. Consider supporting, joining, or connecting with this community, channel, or content in any way that makes sense for you. And then, of course, share this video with somebody because that's how you improve the reach. And then also, we do have merch, which is absolutely magnifique. And we do have some great books out there as well. Please feel free to check those out at your leisure. On top of that, I do think, you're going to hear me say it because it's coming up. Like, man, we're going to be in Raleigh, North Carolina in the month of April, and we're going to be there for 2 days. I'm tempted to make it 3 days because as we're building our team at BridgeCity Global and partnering with other people, this is turning out to be really exciting. So if you're interested in being a part of that event, if you live in the Raleigh area or anywhere within driving distance, why don't you go ahead and register today to let us know that you're going to be there so we can plan accordingly. And if you'd like to support this event, because the thing is, we're trying to make sure that these Bridge City Weekends events are absolutely free, because it's very important to us that there's not a paywall to community. And the big idea behind these events is to build community wherever we are, whether there's already developed community there that we can help support, or whether if there's no community there, then we want to get it spearheaded. We want to get it popping. So if you'd like to financially support the vision of Bridge City Weekends, man, we have a crowdfunding campaign in the description. All right. So let's kind of jump into today's conversation because again, this one is it's going to be interesting, and this was really a part of my slippery slope and deconstruction and deconversion. There was at one point in the latter years of my pastorate, of me being a pastor in pastoral ministry, where I was working on a particular sermon series, and I don't remember which one it was. But kind of like, and I still kind of use that model because that was something very unique to me and the style of ministry that I did. So I still use this very like creative, innovative conversation or series model, but instead of those series being lecture based now, for me they are conversation based. So I was working on this series, and I remember wanting to make a big point of the series, tracing through how Christians had been persecuted over the years, because we obviously believers are the most highly persecuted people in the world, and that was actually my understanding at the time. That was my worldview, that Christians had been highly persecuted ever since day one, and it had been horrible, 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 and we had been just great martyrs, right? So and man, I wish I could remember what the name of that series was, but I know it had some type of warrior connotation to it. Um, so I wanted to use these real stories of Christian persecution, historically, and kind of bring it through the ages to show how resilient believers had been. But what I found to be troubling is that the history that I was discovering did not match the history that I had been taught, or the history that I had received, right? Um, in many cases, what I found, which was the first thing that was kind of very interesting to me, is that much of the way that early Christian persecution had been presented in many of the circles that I was in was highly exaggerated, you know. And so that's what we're going to kind of walk through in some of these in this conversation. And like I said, I've pulled together some notes. I wanted to do this yesterday, but after kind of looking at my notes again, I was like, this is going to get lengthy. So let's just jump into it and see where we go, right? So Christianity has long been presented as the religion of the oppressed, the persecuted, the meek, basically the people who suffered at the hands of Roman authorities and the forces of paganism. What exactly are the forces of paganism? I don't think I've seen that army. I'll come back to that. The narrative of early Christians enduring brutal martyrdoms and suffering for their beliefs has been etched deeply into Christian tradition and Western culture. But this is a narrative that is only incomplete. Well, actually, not only incomplete, it's often dangerously misleading. By focusing almost exclusively on the persecution Christians faced, the historical lens is distorted, casting aside the much more uncomfortable truth. Christianity, once it gained power, was not merely a victim; it became the perpetrator of violence. After with as just much fervor as any group that sought to suppress it. The church's history is soaked in the blood of not just external enemies, but even its own, cannibalizes itself. And it's time we confront this inconvenient fact, one that is too often swept under the rug by apologists seeking to avoid the ugly legacy of Christian brutality. Today, we're going to talk about it. So we'll start with the early Christian context, which is typically we think of with the first and second century. The persecution of Christians in their early years after Jesus' death must be considered within the broader historical and political context of the Roman Empire, especially as it evolved during the first and second centuries. Now, initially, Christians were seen by the Roman authorities as just another sect within Judaism, which was an officially recognized religion. In the first decades after Jesus' death, roughly between 30 to 70 CE, the early Christian community was still largely localized in Judea, and Roman officials didn't actively seek to persecute Christians as a distinct group. The focus was more on Jewish upbringings and maintaining peace in the region. And that is that is a highly piece of critical color of context there, because we can think about other institutions that we are not as familiar with, and we'd likely have a similar relationship. For example, if you've never been Mormon, and if you're not a part of the Mormon faith or the Mormon household of faith, branch of faith, however you do that shit, if you've never studied Mormonism, then you would likely not be able to delineate those who still adopt to a similar faith while separating themselves from the distinctions of that faith. To you, they would all be Mormon, and that's this first point, is that in the turn of the or not turn of the century, but when this you know as Christianity is first evolving, it only exists to it. It only exists to it and its adherents. You know, Christianity, as it exists in the Gospels, would not be a recognized religion, institution, group, or following that would be any way distinct from Judaism. To borrow a phrase and kind of turn it up a little bit, but in the Romans' eyes, this just would have been Jewish people doing what Jewish people do. You know what I'm saying? And so there's going to be, just when looking at things practically, there's an initial absence of systematic persecution, because the religion itself, though the Gospels painted in this one way, it doesn't exist to the Romans yet. It doesn't, you know. And then the term Christian itself doesn't emerge widely until the late first century. You know what I'm saying? Which, of course, the things that we often battle with is that it's the Book of Acts where the word Christian is used. Um, I want to say, I know it's the first time. I'm unsure whether it's the only time. But it's the Book of Acts. I think they said it was at Antioch that the believers were first called Christians. And of course, your immediate worldview, when you're engulfed and immersed into cultural Christianity, is that whoever wrote the Book of Acts in your mind was writing it as the Book of Acts was happening. you know and so when you approach scripture that way, your mindset is then right after Jesus died, these people were calling each other, the other people, Christians. But what we definitely know is that none of these books were written while none of the authors of these books were contemporary with the life of Jesus. None of these books were written while Jesus was living. By far and large, most of the Gospels and epistles are estimated to be, a disciple of a disciple, which honestly, I find that type of academia dishonest, right? Because it's we don't really do that anywhere else. Um, Anywhere else, we just say we don't know. But I notice on the academic side, I mean, there's already a lot of woo shit on the theology side, period. But even the ones who claim to be unbiased and claim to be, no, I'm taking an academic approach. And but when you say a sentence like, "We think this may have been written by a disciple of a disciple," I don't know, that sentence tells me you actually don't have enough information to think that, but that you just want to think that. And so, like, that's not how academia works. That's not how research works. Now, unfortunately, I will say a glaring part of Western research has been impacted that way. Um, which thankfully we are in that phase where as we are becoming a more globalized world, we're able to catch some of those mistakes. And it's not, and I don't want to make it sound like it's only the Western world that makes that mistake. No, we all have the tendency to view new discoveries through the lens of what we understand, but that's a whole nother other situation. Big point is Roman authorities were primarily concerned with political unrest, so they didn't necessarily distinguish Christians from Jews, especially given that many of the early Christians were Jews themselves. Um, as a matter of fact, according to Jesus in the Bible, his version of Christianity, which is not a term that he used, but according to his character, his version of Christianity was only supposed to be to the lost sheep of Israel first, and then the lost sheep of Israel were supposed to be the deliverers of that message to the rest of the world. Because as I constantly remind people, Jesus is a Jewish supremacist. So I like my skin crawls every time somebody shares something about like, oh, these people aren't being real Christians. And I'm like, oh my goodness, please stop that. Like, you cannot make a claim that the Bible is immoral or amoral and that the Bible is filled with all type of horrible things while at the same time trying to hold to a claim that the most critical character, at least to the Christians of the Bible, is actually a good person. And so, like, you're shooting yourself in the foot and you're doing it out of reactionaryism. You know, there's a lot of reactionaryism in the secular community. Let's call that out. All right. So let's kind of get into this a little bit more. So as far as the early period, like Paul's persecution seems to be completely made up. That's a whole nother situation though. But even that would be internal persecution. That wouldn't be in that case, that wouldn't be persecution from the Romans. That would be persecution from the Jews themselves, who at the time were a persecuted people. But I want us to kind of hone in on some of the things that are actually known. So, like, one of the most popular ones is the persecution that took place under Emperor Nero and roughly around 64 Common Era. The first documented and most systematic persecution of Christians did not occur until until the reign of Emperor Nero, and this is 64, and this is the first documented and the first systematic persecution. Now, mind you, this happens after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 Common Era. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire, and this sparked significant state-sponsored violence. Now, there's a few things that I do want to highlight here. Um, we are typically, and wisely so, careful about situations like this because we don't want to victim blame, right? And so But I'm highlighting that for a very good reason, especially for those of us who were believers when we first heard these stories. And then, of course, in the Western world, there are a lot of people who do have a predisposition to have a sensitivity or a grace area, if you will, for Christian beliefs. And so, in many ways, this these situations we haven't always approached these things with the most interrogative eye, out of concern, especially as a believer. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire. The question would be that, would be uncomfortable for you as a believer, maybe, is why did he think they had something to do with the fire? And now the reason I wanted to highlight that, is because when you actually go back and study early Christian history, which is very difficult, like it's you have to you got to navigate through a bunch of fluff. It's almost like the mental health field is becoming as bad as the biblical field, because it's the same type of people who are in it, which is getting scary. But you learn how to navigate, right? And eventually land on some things that are valuable. Um, and so you want to ask, you want to do that deep dive, and what you begin to find is that there are a lot of troubling concerns that stem around the behaviors of the early Christians. Um, and so there's some homework for you. They weren't great people, kind of like today. But Nero's persecution was not a general imperial campaign against Christians, but a response to the specific event of the fire. Many of the Christians killed were prominent in the Christian community, and the persecutions were indeed localized to Rome. So again, this wasn't an all-out. Um, this wasn't an all-out. I mean, this was likely still discriminatory for sure. In no way am I trying to make Nero a hero in any sense, but I am trying to say that the way this is often presented is extremely exaggerated, to the point that Nero waged war against the Christians because of their beliefs, and that's at least not how it's currently recorded in history. At least not when you look at it from an objective perspective. Um, but and again, this early persecution, while gruesome and definitely public, it was relatively isolated in its scope, and it wasn't indicative of an empire-wide systematic campaign against Christians, which is the way some groups try to make this sound. This seemed to be more of a retaliatory effort. I've seen some people do some talks about the Great Fire, but I'd like to see some more detail there. All right, so that was 64. All right. It's pretty much radio silence for another 30 years, another 34 years, and then we get to around 98. 98 to 117 Common Era with Trajans or Trojans. I don't know how to pronounce Romans people's names because they're dead. I don't know them, and I'm black, so I really don't give a fuck how you pronounce their names, because again, they're dead. If they was alive, I might care. Just depends on who the fuck they are. But anyway, there were early persecutions under Roman rule, but they were relatively sporadic. And it's difficult to use the word persecution, again, highlighting the situation with Nero's. I'd want to take a look at more of why Nero thought the Christians were behind the Great Fire. Because there's a difference between being persecuted and being prosecuted. You know what I'm saying? Now, again, I am not an expert on that story. As a person who is a Black African American, sort of, um, while I've always been able to enjoy the mythology of things, I don't concern myself as much with the details of the histories of some of these people, because some of these people are important for different reasons. And then I have other histories that I've studied that have been just more important to me. Um, you know, and that's a whole nother story. That's how my interest in history actually was able to expand, is that I was able to correlate it with my stories and started actually learning about things that are more connected to my heritage, my legacy, my lineage, if you would, which has intense given me and change given me a greater appreciation for other people's history, even without feeling the need to be an expert on it. You see how I did that? You see how I brought it around to you? No, I don't feel a need to be an expert on pronouncing Roman people's names. Hell, not even ancient Egyptians, and I identify with them. But no. So talking about Trajans, I don't know. He had correspondence with Pliny the Younger around 112 Common Era, indicates that while Christians were persecuted for their refusal to worship Roman gods, there was no official empire-wide policy of eradication. In fact, Pliny's letters suggest a more pragmatic approach. Christians were punished if they were reported to authorities, but the empire didn't seek to actively hunt down Christians. And that's a very different worldview. I mean, that's a very different situation. Now, again, I'm not saying it's a great situation. I don't think anything happening 2,000 years ago was absolutely great. I mean, there may have been some things, but the point here is that as a pastor at that time, a pastor had been in it for a while, who was going back to and who really wanted to use this idea of Christian persecution to undergird this new series that I was super excited about. It was very disappointing to start reading through and navigating through the history and see, like the extreme nature that this was presented to me in is not the nature that this actually reads out. So, I couldn't justify building my series off of that. That was one of my slippery slopes, man. Let's keep going. And I promise you, this is gonna zig when you think it's gonna zag. But there was Hadrian and other emperors they're sometimes seen as less hostile towards Christians. Hadrian's policies appears to have been more about managing religious practices within the empire, and persecution was largely a localized individual issue rather than a coordinated empire-wide campaign. And now even just thinking about that one and the last one that I just went through, there are some other just disingenuous factors of this, which I call these out as modern disingenuous factors as well. Is that Christianity always gets to attach itself to things that are not equivalent with it, right? And like that's one of the big dishonesty, one of the probably the biggest dishonest things about Christianity, period, is that it gets to purport that it has this uninterrupted history. I mean, again, remember that was the Catholic Church claim to fame, that it has this uninterrupted history of legacy directly from Jesus through the apostles, which doesn't fucking exist. But in the same way, modern Christians tie themselves to the early Christians. They tie themselves to the Christians who were persecuted. They say we were the same people, but they don't even know what the beliefs of these early people was in most cases, and in many times these beliefs are so contradictory because and I think what often happens here, this is why you need a sociologist at the table, because a theologian can tell you, well, yeah, they were being persecuted because Rome was trying to control religious practices within the empire. All right, now the thing is, that's not an inaccurate statement, it's just an incomplete statement. A person who does not understand the nuance of history will just assume that religion 2,000 years ago meant the same thing that religion does today. And so actually that the word choice is being anachronistically imposed. The Romans would not have saw that as a religious issue, because at this time these things were not religious, they were a part of secular society. Otherwise it wouldn't have been a concern of the empire. So the thing that I always kind of remind people of is what you have to be careful of is superimposing your misguided anachronistic worldview on the text, because so these religious things, no, secular. So the religious things wouldn't have been about who you pray to. It wouldn't have been about what your prayers look like, whether you were dipped, emerged, or sprinkled. It would have been, did you pay your taxes at the altar? You know, because at this time in human history, The gods are not something that have been demonstrated as separate from existence. They're not something that have been demonstrated to be separate from reality. While there is this growing, if you will, this evolution that is happening among philosophical camps who are coming to the place where they think, well, maybe the gods are the personifications of the things that we want to think about the world. Yes, those conversations are going on as early as, 3,500 years ago, I believe. So that those conversations are going on, but by far and large, the status quo, almost like America today, is God is still a real thing, even though we don't live like that. You see what I'm saying? And so at this time, the focus on Christians is not necessarily religious in the way that we would understand it today. It would be economic. That would be the concern for the empire. You've determined that you're not going to pay your taxes because you have this different belief system, right? But see, then that different belief system there doesn't align with the belief system that Jesus taught, because Jesus taught that it was important to render unto Caesar what is Caesar. See what I'm saying? See what I'm saying? Which is kind of crazy, because that means that, and I'm not on the tax the church bandwagon. I'm not a fan of that argument. I find that to be a tokenism argument. But if churches wanted to be more in line with what Jesus said, then they would, forego tax exemption themselves. And before you say anything, I challenge you to actually do the work and figure out how many churches have actually done that. It's not just a few. There are quite a few churches in the United States of America who refuse tax exemption status, primarily because they were under the misguided notion that if we're tax exempt, the government can tell us what to do and preach and stuff like that. So there's a lot of ignorance out there, which is why I tell the secular community, like, please don't be just like the religious community and just spout. Don't spout nonsense just because somebody you like said it. Still verify the information. This is why, like, y'all know I get on to y'all all the time when you ask me for my sources. No, go verify the information, motherfucker. Do the work. Like, that's the problem. Like, that's like, especially for the United States, we have to fix that shit. This is how you get propaganda, when you don't hold people accountable to their own understanding. You're not supposed to be coming to the same conclusions that I come to just because I came to them and you like the way that I sound. You can hear the conclusions that I come to, and then you wrestle with that shit yourself, but you need to be accountable for your own understanding. You shouldn't understand it because I gave you my sources. You should understand it because you looked at some sources and you came to some understanding of your own. This is one of those ways that we can counteract misinformation. See, I think one of the antiquated ways that we have approaching this stuff is we think the best way to counteract misinformation is with good information. But no, the only thing you're doing is changing a label at that moment. The people who are giving misinformation aren't calling it bad information. They're not calling it misinformation. So just by saying, no, we're just going to put more good information out there, that does no difference if the people don't know how to, if the people themselves don't know how to discern the difference between valid information and invalid information. And so, and honestly, I don't understand why this is such a fucking mystery, because this even dates all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Hell, this dates back to ancient Egypt, to Kemet, god damn it. But like, the true danger of a democracy is when education becomes flawed. The only way you can support the integrity of a democracy is to support the integrity of public education. That has not been done. And so if that has not been done, then you are constantly creating a mass of people who are going to base what they think based off of what titillates them the most, not what's accurate. This is the problem we've created for ourselves. Dang, I ain't supposed to be talking about this. But I was hanging out with Jimmy Snow and the crew yesterday, and it was a political conversation, so that shit is on my mind. All right, so now let's talk about the era of the Great Persecution. Now, the more extensive and systematic persecution did not come until the reign of Diocletian, and this was late 3rd century, around 303, 311 Common Era. Now, consequently, this era of great persecution also just so happens to show up around the same time that Christianity, for the first time, and again, this is, yes, roughly 300 years later, when Christianity, for the first time, is actually becoming some type of organized religion. Now, it is not there yet, but it's on its way. Um, Now, this period marks the so called Great Persecution, which targeted Christian leaders and sacred text. It was the most intense and widespread persecution up to that point, but still not a universal imperial policy. And so, again, the main things that I'm highlighting here is that there's been quite a bit of exaggeration in what happened. And many times that exaggeration exists because these people know that they can find protection in the lack of clarity, in the questions that are not going to be asked, and the things that are going to be assumed. And so there were many early Christian writings, particularly those from the later centuries, 2nd to 4th century, sought to depict early Christian history as a period of intense persecution to emphasize the strength and faith of early Christians. Martyrdom stories became a major part of Christian identity, but this narrative was often constructed retrospectively. Now, why do you think martyrdom had to become a major part of Christianity? Because none of the people who would have, and of course, I'm not a Jesus realist. I forgot what you call those people. I'm not a Jesus mythicist. I'm a Jesus apathist. So I don't give a fuck if some, guy lived all these years ago who had no powers. Doesn't mean shit to me. But according to the understandings, if Jesus then was a real character and really was crucified, then he absolutely did not raise from the dead, which was apparently an expectation. But to be quite clear, from a Jewish perspective, there was no expectation of a Messiah to ever die. There was that was and I mean, if you just think about it pragmatically, it's an unnecessary trick, which I talk about in my book, Christ Held Up. If you've not checked that book out yet, man, I encourage you to, because I highlight some things in there that often get glanced over. But this becomes the reason why martyrdom 300 years later becomes a central tenet of Christianity, because Jesus is not a savior, he's a martyr. You see? Now, the reason this particular ideology took a little while to kick up in steam is because the people who allegedly bought into this idea about this being the Son of God would have been so convinced that he can't be dead, he has to come back. And again, there is no promise of a messianic resurrection in any of the Old Testament books. It's not an expectation of it's not only not an expectation of Judaic thought, it's not an expectation of Hebraic thought. Period. So this, which again, I remind people that the New Testament is primarily written in Greek for a reason. But I also remind people that even the version of the Old Testament that the New Testament references is the Greek version for a reason. Because at best, at this moment in time, you are dealing with Hellenized Jews. That is one of my biggest concerns with many religious books or many religious stories. Is because in most cases they are usurping the entire heritage of entire groups of people, claiming that it is something as uniquely theirs. And when you're looking at, we'll just use the Old Testament and New Testament. When you're looking at these stories, your worldview is this is the narratives of the Hebrews. That is absolutely incorrect. This is the narrative of a of one tribe of 12 and one sect of that one tribe of 12. So no, this is not an adequate depiction of true history because it's already cut out, demonized, and villainized the worldview of the other tribes. You know, like it amazes me people who read through the New Testament and don't really understand what this conflict between Judea and Samaria is. This is a southern northern kingdom conflict. This is a Israel Judah conflict. You know what I'm saying? This is 11 versus 1 type of situation. But then not only that, even, because I tell people to kind of, to break those things down, right? If we want to me, and I'll be honest, it might be my neurospicy, but I do take a different approach to things. I don't like, and this is, I think it's what ultimately made me a better preacher and what finally made me an even better atheist is that I want it to be as true to the story as possible. I want it to have an understanding. I didn't want to have an indoctrination. I wanted to have an understanding. And this is what's wrong with so many people today. You just want people to think what you think as opposed to wanting them to be able to have an understanding. I want to have an understanding. That's how we protect ourselves against indoctrination. And so, but when you look at scripture, you say this is a Hebrew book. That's not accurate. The best you can say as far as the Old Testament is that it's a Jewish book. The best. And the New Testament, you cannot call the New Testament a Jewish book unless you're saying Hellenistic Jews. And you can tell that by the systems that are represented by the time we get to the New Testament, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Sanhedrin, who by far and large do not exist in the Old Testament. This is a different group of people. But not only does this book, but the book is also claiming to tell stories about these other tribes, but yet none of the authors from the other tribes are kept in. The ideal is because the book says those other tribes are lost. And so because the book says that, you buy into that. That's not how academia works, right? We don't just say, oh, these tribes are lost to history because the book said so. It's not how that works, because honestly, they're not lost, they're arbitrary. The names are arbitrary. They don't really mean shit, but I mean, that's just true of all names at the end of the day. The names are arbitrary. These people, as far as for the period of time that's represented in the book, especially the Old Testament, these are just Canaanites. And so to have a better understanding of Hebraic culture, you have to have an understanding of Canaanitic culture. And then all the cards kind of fall down. All right. I don't know why I told y'all this one's gonna be a little meaty. All right, so the big point here is that a lot of the martyrdom narratives of Christianity end up being added retrospectively, and it's my hypothesis that much of this goes on in order to wrestle with the absence of an unreturned savior. So now the purpose, and again, like this is how different early Christianity is from today. Now the purpose then isn't to await a resurrected savior. It isn't to await the return of the Lord at this moment. It's to be one of the martyrs. It's to follow, and honestly, you do see that language with Jesus. Take up my cross and follow me. It's a death cult. If y'all didn't know, it's a death cult. So Christian apologists from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, such as Tertullian and Justin Martyr, sought to defend Christianity and claimed that the Christians had been unfairly persecuted. Now, let's watch this. From 0 to 300, Christians as any type of institutionalized group do not exist. Ultimately, they are a subsect of Jews that eventually become problematic for the Roman Empire, but not making too much of a stink, other than the 64 Great Fire, which I still want to go back and do some digging there, but not becoming something organized until around the 2nd and 3rd century, or actually 3rd and 4th century. And yet they have apologists this early. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's almost like in order to have apologists that early, you'd have to know this is some bullshit. You know what I'm saying? Otherwise, there will be no need for apologists. Everybody will remember that time that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. You know what I'm saying? Collectively. Like, as a nation, we remember when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. We were not there, but we remember. You get what I'm saying? As a nation, we remember 80 and however many years ago, our fathers set foot on this continent, a new nation, I guess. Was that Gettysburg? I think so. But remember those things. Those things are a part of our collective history. Now, sure, we can say we are better organizers, and if we would like to, than the Romans were. And so that's why I remember those things. But I don't know if we remember those things because of organization. I think we'd remember those things because of socialization, that these things have been a part of the social zeitgeist. They have been a part of our cultural conversation. So surely, if there was this carpenter who was crucified and this great voice came from heaven and everybody who was dead got up and walked around, it would be a part of the conversation and therefore would not need any apologia. But the fact that Christianity needs apologist defense, that it needs apologetic defense from damn near day one, illustrates that there's never been any evidence for this. That's the only reason you would need apologists that early. Again, if any of these great things that have happened, sure, there would still be people who did not believe them. Yeah. But at that moment, you know that there's no reason for them not to believe them. And so you wouldn't even waste your fucking breath trying to convince people who saw the dead people. You know? So the people you're trying to convince are people who have no reason to believe it. Man. Let's continue. Now, so people like Tertullian's writings do often highlight persecution in ways that have been proven to be exaggerated for rhetorical purposes, aiming to solidify Christian identity in the face of external hostility. And this is something, this is a type of propaganda we see used, over and over again. It is a consistent type of propaganda. So much of the historical narrative around Christian persecution, particularly during the first centuries, is constructed from Christian sources written retrospectively. If that's not a fucking red flag on the play, I don't know what is. I'm going to say that part one more time because I have it in my notes so I can reread that motherfucker. Much of the historical narrative around Christian persecution, particularly during the first few centuries, is constructed from Christian sources, red flag number one, written retrospectively. Red flag number two, written after the fact, much later, So now, early Christians facing social and political hostility wrote extensively about the injustices they experienced, often focusing on the resilience of their faith. However, these accounts often exaggerated the extent of their suffering, potentially as a means of solidifying Christian identity and distinguishing themselves from their persecutors. The martyrdom literature, for example, was sometimes viewed as both a spiritual triumph and a form of propaganda, which it absolutely is. Christians, especially in the earliest centuries, was often framed as a persecuted minority religion. This martyrdom narrative has been deeply embedded in Christian tradition, especially in the writings of the church fathers like Tertullian, like I mentioned earlier, and also Augustine, who made the case for the noble suffering of Christians. While persecution undoubtedly occurred, its scale and nature were oftentimes exaggerated to emphasize Christian fortitude, which could obscure the narrative of Christian violence and intolerance, But in the midst of all of this, before coming to the more later centuries, if you will, there's another type of persecution that is often left out of this conversation, but I can find more of this kind of persecution against Christians than I can from any other group. And so, even before the church became the dominant institution in the Roman Empire, different Christian factions often fought violently against each other over theological disagreements. Early Christians saw certain theological ideas as heresies and persecuted those they saw as deviating from Orthodox Christian doctrine. Now, and again, that again, that kind of makes me go back to, I wonder why, what was this idea? Why did people think the Christians were behind this great fire? Now I've heard some thoughts before, but I'd like to hear some more. But this highlights, and I mean, this was as early as the second century, by the way. This was as early as the second century where these Christians were having violent clashes against each other. You also have the Montanist controversy. They were an early Christian sect who believed in the continuation of prophetic revelations. Their movement led to internal disputes, and some Orthodox Christians sought to suppress the Montanist teachings. But like, even when we use terms like Orthodox, it's a misnomer. It's a term that it's really it's virtue signaling. It's a dog whistle term, and I say that because we can't point to who the first believers were, so we have no way to determine what was orthodox and what was not. And so often, orthodox is determined by the people who were most invested in this particular version of the story. You get what I'm saying? Okay. All right. But yeah, their movement led to a lot of fighting, a lot of violence. And it's again still second century. There was the or the Donatellos. They were a Christian sect in North Africa who believed that clergy who had renounced their faith during times of Roman persecution were unworthy to administer sacraments. This led to violent conflicts between the Donatists, and the Catholic Church, particularly in regions like Carthage. The church, under leaders like Augustine of Hippo, was not afraid to use force to suppress the Donatists and viewed them as a major threat to Christian unity. And so now I wanted to highlight a few of these just to remind us that much of the persecution of Christians came from other Christians. And this is one of those unspoken unknowns that is actually 100% a fact. The majority of Christian persecution, when you actually start doing the work, comes from other Christians. Like almost every time you see Christians persecuted, there's another group of Christians who are pushing for that persecution. So though Christians were often victims of state-sponsored violence, it's important to know that the Roman state viewed Christians as a dangerous sect and occasionally responded with force. During the reign of emperors like Decius and Diocletian, Christians were persecuted with violence, imprisonment, and execution as part of imperial efforts to root out what was perceived as a destabilizing force. And again, this is the other disingenuous aspect of talking about Roman persecution of Christianity, because we often allow it to be phrased in the most unrealistic way possible. The Romans were persecuting the Christians because they hated Jesus and didn't want Jesus to come back. And it's like, okay, now if that's how you're actually going to look at the story, then you've already decided not to do history. You've already decided not to do anthropology. You've already decided not to do sociology. You've already decided not to do the fucking work. You know what I'm saying? So no, in order to have a real good understanding of what this persecution was, why this persecution existed, you have to have a more mature worldview to be able to go ahead and take they're persecuting them because the devil made them do it off the fucking table, and be able to see, okay, what is actually going on politically, what is going on economically, and again, hate to sound like victim blaming, but what the fuck are these Christians doing? Which are questions that nobody seems to be asking, which again shows the disingenuousness of just being Christians, because you would think that in order to be a good Christian, that you would have to be an expert on what made a good Christian in the beginning. But as you will find, most Christians have a undereducated and misinformed relationship with their own religion. But that's how that works. In some cases, as I've mentioned, the persecution of Christians was fueled by local bishops and clergy. Bishops in early Christian communities advocated for violence against those they saw as heretics or as dissenters within the Christian community itself. This is an early example of Christian violence against other Christians. And that violence doesn't stop for a long time, y'all. We've barely made it into the 3rd century yet. So now when you get to the 4th century, you have Constantine, which everybody likes to talk about. And I noticed that most people, when they talk about Constantine and the creeds and the edicts, they get it absolutely wrong, because most of them are oftentimes just parroting what they heard somebody else say without actually going back and checking the information. And again, the reason I caution against this is because then you start regurgitating that information to believers as this is the atheist community's argument against this, and then your argument is 100% flawed, and then it just spits right back in the face of secularism and reason, and it gives believers more ammo to say they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And so one of the things that I do encourage us all to do is that if you're not as informed on the subject, I don't care how bold the person you heard saying it felt about it, you can't vicariously just take that boldness and start saying some shit because somebody else was boldly saying it. I'm just telling, these are just small things, just not to use a scripture, but it's the little foxes that ruin the vineyard. By far and large, secularism does not look like a safe option to many people, because there's just as much misinformation on this side as there is the other side. We are just unbiased. We're just so biased to our misinformation, and we just hate the information of the other side so bad that we say there's no way you could look at our misinformation and look at their misinformation and think they're the same. And it's like, well, that's just not the fucking point. In most cases, people are going to go with the devil they know, And so the point is, like, if you want to actually reach people, there's only one way to do it. Be better. And if that's offensive to you, grow the fuck up. You're welcome. All right. So, after Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and it became the state religion, the church's newfound power allowed it to use violence to suppress rival religious practices. This violence wasn't solely against non-Christians. It also targeted other Christian sects considered heretical. And this is the information that I started coming across when I was researching this damn near 15, 16 years ago for my little sermon series, is that while not only is the idea of Christians being horribly persecuted horribly exaggerated, but the fact that Christians were a part of persecuting other Christians from day damn one, and then responsible for persecuting every other group they could from the moment they became a power source. Now that was just horribly understated. And it wasn't a comfortable place to sit in. There was the Arian controversy, which centered on the nature of Christ's divinity, was one of the first major theological disputes within Christianity. Now, I want to point this out. If one of the first major theological disputes within Christianity is in the 4th century, what does that tell you about the structure of Christianity prior to then? Is that ultimately, I think what most people, like, sometimes people say this, but they're wrong when they say it, right? But, well, let me say, they're not inaccurate, they're just incomplete, right? Yes, Christianity was formalized through Constantine, through the Council of Nicaea. It's formalized there. It exists prior to that, but its existence prior to that was more so like Gnosticism, agnosticism. It was more so like African traditional spiritual systems. These were different groups who had attached themselves to a similar character, which is not something that is unique in the span of mythology and those type of belief systems. But these were different groups who had attached themselves to the same or a similar character to tell these stories. But it did not exist as a cohesive religion. And even though it was formulated in the 4th century, it still did not become a cohesive religion. It has been a warmongering death cult. And what it continues to offer to its God on its altar is death. So the Council of Nicaea, which was of course 325 Common Era, produced a creed that defined Orthodox Christian belief. All right, which means to use the word Orthodox prior to 325 is absolutely inappropriate. There was no Orthodox belief prior to the 4th century. You get what I'm saying? So then what determined which group's supremacy? And I think that's what was creating much of the issues for the Roman Empire at that time. But of course, the moment you define something as Orthodox, you now determine that there is heresy. So this led to the persecution of those who did not conform to the Nicene Creed. Arians who rejected the creed faced violence and exile. Christian emperors like Theodosius enforced the Nicene Creed by outlawing Arianism and other heretical beliefs, which led to violent repression. Now, mind you, this is Christian violence against Christian, and this is the day, like the same damn year, the same day, week, month, year, and century that Christianity actually becomes a formalized religion. It continues the violence that it had already been committing against other believers, which, mind you, is anti-biblical according to what they ended up canonizing, because Jesus constantly told the disciples, if they're not against us, they're for us. And that's why, like, you know, there is no version of Christianity from century to century that matches the version of Christianity before it. So with the rise of Christianity as the state religion in the Roman Empire, pagan practices were systematically suppressed. Under Emperor Theodosius, pagan rituals were banned and temples were destroyed. The violence toward pagans and their sacred sites was a state-sponsored effort to eliminate non-Christian religious practices. Now, mind you, the narratives that Christians were so horribly persecuted against, but there are no true state-sponsored efforts to eliminate Christian religious practices. But from the moment Christianity becomes recognized as a religion, its job becomes to do the very thing that it has claimed that others have done to it without evidence, or without sufficient evidence. Hoy. And you know, there was the destruction of the Serapeum, and which is based off of Serapis in Alexandria, and that's 391 Common Area. And of course, that was done by a Christian mob, and it's one of the most, you know, one of the famous examples of this violent suppression. But as an African American, I'm very familiar with Christianity's violent suppressions. Strange fruit, blood at the leaves, blood at the roots. That was Christianity's violent suppressions. That was Christianity saying, we don't like you practicing your religion of freedom. You know what I'm saying? I see how Christianity has practiced violent suppression. I've seen what happened to homosexuals. Christianity violently suppressed it. Like, honestly, that is the only defining characteristic of Christianity that has not changed since its existence to 2025, is that it has consistently remained violent in the majority form. Which, when I say in the majority form, I mean, sure, you can go to plenty of individual Christians who say, no, I'm not violent, I don't believe in violence. But anytime you're talking to a Christian group in a majority form, Christian nation, oh, they're always down for violence. They believe in war. They support war. In some cases, local Christian mobs led by zealous bishops or clerics would destroy pagan temples, statues, and altars. These acts of violence were seen as part of the divine mandate to bring the entire empire into Christian conformity. but they represent one of the earliest instances of Christian violence against other belief systems. You know, I don't use the term Christian nationalism a lot, other than, because I know it's a term that many of you like to use. So when I do use it, I say, no, the Bible is supportive of this. But the term that I prefer, because it's the only scripturally accurate term, is Christian imperialism. For those of you who think that the Christian goal is nationalism, you ain't been paying attention. It's imperialism. This is how we're in the situation that we're in now. But I mean, like, I don't know how we didn't ever find it problematic that in a democratic country, one of our major religions is theocratic and is based off of a monarchical type of dictatorship. Like, I don't know how we did not recognize that, no, this would be a threat to democracy. I absolutely understood as a pastor that God is not in support of democracies. I've preached that several times, that God is not a democratic God. God says there are no other gods before me. God is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. You cannot cultivate that type of an ideology in the majority of your populace and actually be able to effectively preserve a democracy. Because then, just from a religious and a cultural point of view, the democracy is viewed as inferior to the theocracy. No, this is why I am one of the people, regardless of how many other people have talked, I've told you over and over again, I'm not shocked by anything that has happened lately. The writing was on the fucking wall, But then again, like, I was in the camp, like I was a part of this stuff. So like when I hear I didn't know Christians believe this. I'm like, what did you think they believe? They call their God their savior and their king. If you have to choose between your king, who is the king of all kings, and your president, and you treat your belief as true, which one are you going to choose? If you treat your belief as true, and you have to choose between what your king of king wants, through whatever spokesperson you believe it is, and what the people of your country want, you're going to choose what the fuck your imaginary king wants. And this is why, like, no, what I've said, I'm not anti-religion, I am anti-superstition. It is absolutely irresponsible to allow that type of framework to be cultivated in a country that is supposed to be promoting the values of democracy. You have now conflated democracy with theocracy, and the Christians are going to do their best, the ones who don't know any better, are going to do their best to use that democracy against you to get back through to a theocracy, because it is already their admitted preference. You know what I'm saying? You can't be pro-democracy and pro-theocracy. One of these things is not like the other. All right, so let's go in the 4th and 5th century. So after Constantine's reign, as Christianity became more institutionalized, the relationship between Christians and Jews became increasingly hostile. Some church fathers, such as John Chrysostom, sure he made that shit up, advocated violence against Jews and Jewish communities in certain regions, suffered attacks from Christian mobs. For example, Jewish synagogues were destroyed and Jews were forced to either convert or face significant violence. And so a lot of times, sometimes when I talk about the New Testament, you'll hear me reference it as the Greco-Roman book. But I mean, come on, this is what's happening. And so as notice as Christianity becomes more Roman, or as Rome becomes more Christianity, as Rome becomes more Christian, which I guess that's not accurate. You can't say Rome became more Christian. Christianity just became increasingly more Roman, So this real, like, it is a hypothesis here. I would stand to argue that the real issue between Christianity and the Jews had nothing to do with the Jesus character in the first place. That stuff was probably retroactive. is that these Christians are like, because just notice the Romans were persecuting the Jews, and then all of a sudden the Romans become Christians, and then they start persecuting the Jews. This just seems to be a Roman issue. You know, that's just me. And of course, I am being a little tongue in cheek, but at the same time, jewels is being dropped. There was the Council of Elvira. You know, this council issued decrees that targeted Jews for their refusal to accept Christianity, and at various points in history, Christian authorities and mobs engaged in violent acts against Jewish populations, especially during times of religious and social tension. What I hope that you're taking from these notes so far is that Christianity has been bloodily violent from day damn one. Now, we've walked through the first through the 5th centuries, but let's bring it into like modern times a little bit. Let's talk about something that we all remember. Does anybody else remember the fucking Crusades, 1095 to 1291? This is literally over 200 years of church-sanctioned brutality. It is one of the most glaring examples of Christian brutality in all of history. A series of religious wars initiated by the church to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. And if you don't think that that shit is still at play, you're fucking stupid. But the Crusaders' brutal tactics include massacres of Jews, Muslims, and even fellow Christians, like the sacking of Constantinople. This stuff is well documented. These events are often seen as a direct result of Christian ideology, of Christian authority, where the concept of a just war is used to justify horrific violence against non-believers. But even now, do we really have to wait until people are doing physical acts of violence to people? Can't we now tell that that same type of thing is being stirred up? And I'm trying to do my best to tell the secular community to please stop acting like a bunch of bitches and stop complaining about you're going to move and you're going to run away and you don't know what you're going to fucking do. Like, please learn how to grow the fuck up and fight your battles. It is time. Like, listen, I didn't leave the church to join a losing fucking team. You know, so act like you know how to grow a pair, whether those are balls, ovaries, or titties. Grow a pair and start determining what we're going to do to ensure that people are protected. And if you're not trying to do that, you're not a fucking humanist. You're a billboard. Sorry, not sorry. So the Inquisition represents another chapter of Christian brutality, 12th through the 19th century, 500 fucking years. See, do you see here? Christianity doesn't take a break from its brutality. It doesn't. It doesn't. I think even when we get a little better as a society, we will look back on America's history, on the U.S.'s history, and realize that we've been using our military for Christian violence for a long time. The Catholic Church sought to root out heresy in every form that it could, using torture, execution, and persecution of suspected witches, Jews, and non-Catholic Christians. Not to mention, this is the same time where the Catholic Church decides that anybody who is not Christian can have their lands taken and that they can be subjugated as slaves. Yeah. The Spanish Inquisition, and just to mind you, this wasn't just one group of Christians that thought this was okay. At this moment in history, Christianity has splintered so much. We're in the 12th through the 19th century. Christianity has splintered so much that there are several different churches, there are several different Christian authorities, and what all of the Christian authorities in the world agree to for 500 years is killing people and enslaving them. The Spanish Christians, the Portuguese Christians, the Dutch Christians, the French Christians, the Belgian Christians. Christians, wherever you found them, as groups, were absolutely okay with violence and brutality because it is the root of this message. Okay? Let's take it back to Jesus. All right. If the purpose of Jesus, what from a literary perspective, wasn't to resurrect and return and save the world, then what does this character, how does this character meet a literary need? All right. Now, we now have the backdrop of history to see what literary need this character meets. Are you ready for this? You've likely overlooked it. The sole purpose of Jesus is to have a reason to feel like you need vengeance. It's to have someone to attach to who you identify with as good and innocent, who was beaten brutally with no grace and no mercy, so that then you can excuse brutal behavior against those who have been classified as offenders on behalf of avenging this character. You see what I'm saying? And of course, the 16th through the 19th centuries, during the age of European colonial expansion, Christian missionaries played a significant role in the brutal colonization of Africa, the Americas, parts of Asia, Australia, which somehow always gets left out of these conversations, even though the dark people in Australia went through the exact same shit as the dark people over here, you know? In many cases, the church justified the forced conversion and subjugation of indigenous people as a divine mission. This resulted in the violent destruction of native cultures, the enslavement of millions, and widespread atrocities, all under the guise of spreading Christianity. But you must remember that Christianity is attached to war. It is inextricably, it cannot be detached from the concept of war. From the Christian worldview, their whole existence is because of war. They exist because there was war in heaven, and they will exist until there is war on the earth and in heaven, and then God starts everything over because he fucked up so badly the first time. You know? In the context of the Reformation, there was religious wars between Catholics and Protestant. There was literally the 30 Years' War, led to massacre and brutal treatment of dissenting groups. The violence committed during this period often escalated from ideological difference, but was framed within the context of religious righteousness. As Christianity spread and became the dominant religion, especially after the conversion of Emperor Constantine and the establishment of Christianity as the Roman Empire state religion, the church's status transformed from a persecuted minority to a powerful institution with considerable authority. Once in power, the church sought to secure its position, and as such, narratives of Christian persecution shifted toward a focus on martyrdom and the righteousness of the faith. This would serve to legitimize the authority of the church and distract from the violence it began to perpetuate in its own right. Many early Christian writers and apologists framed Christianity as a persecuted faith in order to gain sympathy and solidify its place in the Roman world. This approach, while helping the religion survive and spread, also contributed to an image of Christians as constant victims. Over time, this became a central part of Christian identity, obscuring a nuanced view of the church's own violent actions during every period it has had power. There is not one moment in human history where the church has been in power and has not been brutal. While Christianity has played a crucial role in shaping Western civilization and providing moral and ethical frameworks for millions, so they say, it's important to critically examine both the persecution and the violence associated with the faith. In doing so, we can better understand how religious institutions have both suffered and perpetuated violence, all in the name of God. Christian brutality, whether through the Crusades, the Inquisition, colonialism, continues to affect the legacy of the church today and all of us who have to live in any type of connection with these people. Many scholars, including those from secular, post-colonial, and humanist perspectives, argues that an honest reckoning with this history is essential to understanding that the role religion has played in shaping global power dynamics and conflicts is absolutely intolerable. Christianity, like other major religions, has both been a source of teachings that have inspired people to do great things for social welfare, sure. But it has also been a source of violence, oppression, and absolute cultural destruction. Christianity's story is one of brutal contradictions, where faith once persecuted for its belief becomes the very force of oppression it once claimed to suffer under. While Christian martyrdom is often painted as a symbol of strength in the face of adversity, the truth is far more complex and ugly. In fact, the real story of Christianity is not one of passive suffering, but of institutionalized violence. Violence not only against external enemies, but also against enemies of its own household. From the early internal heresies to the bloody conquest of the Crusades, the Inquisition's torturous quest to stamp out dissent, and the destruction wrought during colonial missions, Christianity's violent legacy cannot be overlooked, nor overstated. This history is not just one of victimhood, as the church so often claims, but of brutality perpetuated under the guise of divinity. It is high time that we look past the comfortable narratives of Christian persecution and confront the blood-soaked reality of its rise to power. The violence was not just a product of a few bad apples. It was baked into the very foundations of Christianity's expansion. It's one of the reasons that I knew, like, Jordan Peterson was a dumbass. One of the first things I've heard him debate in, or he said, well, we know that Christianity is valid because it's been here so long. Like, what now? Like you have to be completely ignorant of history to make such an assumption. And so I hope today's conversation has given you some insight into just how violent and bloody this religion is. But mind you, this religion opens up with blood. This is a God who requires blood. This is a Savior who constantly tells people that I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. Yeah, this is what you're dealing with. You're finally looking behind the curtain and you're seeing where much of this violence comes from. I did another video a while back about the hidden aggression behind preaching, because it was something that I long thought was just in the black church. But then if you really begin to study churches culturally, you start finding that there is this connection to aggression in preaching. I encourage you to check it out. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this conversation today. I do hope I said something that got your mind ticking. I definitely got to jump back to work. I am running out of time, but I appreciate you all. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, hit that alert notification bell, consider joining, supporting, or connecting with this community channel or content in any way that makes sense for you. Share this video. Please share it. Or don't share it, and maybe that'll make you share it. But share this video and check out our merch. We have some really dope merch. Our Raleigh stuff is doing well right now, selling. So I'm excited about that. And also, support the Raleigh event. We'd love to see you there. We'd love to build community with you there. Let's accelerate community building this year, because it's going to be necessary. It's going to be necessary that we can build as much local and tangible community as we can in real local areas that is supplemented and connected to this online space. But we need to build these networks. All right, y'all. It's important. And so if you're as excited about that as we are, consider checking out our Raleigh Weekends event. The information is in the description. You can support through crowdfunding, and you can register for free to let us know that you're going to be there, or let us know that you're going to be helping out. All right, so I think that's all I have for now, y'all. Thank y'all for hanging out with me, man. Until next time, y'all keep rising, stay progressive, And if you can, stay as beautiful as a motherfucker. I'll holler at you later.